Okay, I suppose we can start, and Costa will join us
Okay.
in a while. I suppose tonight, which is our fourth meeting, we can use more Greek since it doesn't seem, that we have people that don't know Greek. So we will be using English basically, but also Greek here and there, which will make things more interesting philosophically, at least. Okay, so the fourth meeting is about Saint Photius, the Great, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and we are going to look into his work, that is into, let's say, snippets of his work, as a critical student of Hellenic philosophy. Because if Photius presents an interesting case in terms of Byzantine philosophy, it's because he deals with Hellenic philosophy quite critically, as truly independent and many a time formidable, thinker. He's not someone who one would call like a dupe, or someone who just imitates and takes things at face value, but he is a quite well-read person when it comes to ancient Greek philosophy, and also a critical one as such. Now, Photius comes in the 9th century. Basically, his life spans over most of the 9th century, from 820 up to 890, 91. So he's firmly, situated within the 9th century. Now, what happens in the 9th century? Basically, we have the second phase of iconoclasm, 814 up to 843, the second phase. We have deterioration in the relationships between the East and the West, the Eastern Church and the Western Church, the so-called Photian schism. And this century, at the same time, so we have on the one, something, one would describe it as negative, as, a problem, to say the least, iconoclasm. Then you have the schism, which again is a problem, negative. And then you have this century as the beginning of the first Byzantine humanism. The 9th century is the beginning of the first Byzantine humanism. The term has been used by Paul Lemaire. He has written this.
Did you say ecumenism or humanism?
Humanism.
Oh, humanism.
Yeah. So we have the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. These are the first Byzantine, Renaissance and humanism. Paul Lemaire has written this very famous book of his. Okay, and l'humanisme byzantin, the Byzantine humanism, or Byzantinos humanismos. And if you haven't read it, it's a very good, like classic by now book regarding letters, pedia, culture, thinking in general, intellectual life, history of ideas in Byzantium. So these are, this is one of the, let's call it paradoxes, we come across in history. You have a context, a historical context, where everything is just in a total mess. And then you have concomitantly something which is like a flourishing. So at the religious and political level, we have problems, but at the level of ideas, something new is being born, in the 9th century. So this is a very interesting juxtaposition or antinomy, if I may say. And Photius is the cardinal figure. His family, he comes from a noble family, actually with many connections to the imperial house. So he comes from such a family which had a iconophile profile. So during the second iconoclastic controversy, his family suffered a lot. So he comes out of that. He's really, a child of that phase. He is the immediate person involved in the Photian schism. I would say what that. I'll just remind you what that schism is about. Before Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople was Ignatius, and Ignatius, to cut a long story short, fell off, with the imperial house, and they deposed him, and then they made Photius into a patriarch. Now the West, the Pope, thought that this was uncanonical. It was unheard of, a patriarch, to be deposed without proper, investigation and a trial. So they didn't recognize Photius, and they anathematized the new, establishment, and that's how the schism started. And then, of course, when Photius became a patriarch, he retaliated. So there's this sort of, very clashy, very sort of, there's lots of tension there. At the end of the day, of course, because Photius became a patriarch 2 times, during the second phase of his patriarchate, things were sort of, fixed. But that took nearly 20 years. So he is the person in the middle of all this, and of course he is the most important figure in the incipient phase of the Byzantine Renaissance, the most learned, the most important scholar in this first phase. Afterwards, we have other people as well, like Mikhail Psellos, whom we will, see in our next meeting. Now, what is of interest for us is, a big question is, of course, if we want to contextualize things, why does this Renaissance take place? I mean, suddenly the Byzantines start reading the Greeks. Suddenly they discover, that they have this heritage, which is so important. Had the reading, the study, the exploration of this heritage stopped at some stage? Or is it simply a different sort of experiencing, relating to this heritage. We know that the last philosophers in the pagan, Hellenic, ancient Greek tradition died. We saw this when we were talking about Saint Maximus. They died in the early 6th century. So Maximus is born a couple of decades after those last philosophers, Olympiodorus and Simplicius. Then, of course, there is a from 630 to 820, it's 200 years, because Photius is born in 820. So 630, 635, the early 7th century, it's 2 centuries. So as far as we know, Hellenic letters didn't stop. Of course, during the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, what we do see is, and this is something we read in the book by Paul Lemaire, if we look into the manuscript tradition of various ancient Greek works being copied and copied and copied, we see that from the 5th to the 7th century, those 3 centuries, there is a decline in the number of the copies, which means that although the tradition of the heritage, is known, is perpetuated, is kept alive, the interest is not that pronounced. Now, this may be due to reasons like, the successive controversies in Byzantium, the Christological controversies, 5th century, 6th century, 7th century. So they are, entangled within this series of clashes and debates and problems that are their priority. So the Hellenic side of things goes to the side, this sideline. This might be one of the explanations. Another explanation might be, don't forget, we have in the 632, we have the death of Muhammad. And then we have 1 century of galloping expansion of Islam. So the 7th, early 8th century, 7th century basically is a century where the Byzantines encounter something that they couldn't have imagined. No one could have imagined, the Arabs, basically, the Arabs of the Hijaz, Mecca, basically, because they were the leading elites of the Umayyad dynasty. No one could imagine that they would, take over the entire North Africa and Middle East in 100 years, going from India to Spain. It was unthinkable, and from a certain perspective, it's amazing. So there are these general, historical problems, Christological debates, clashes, whole churches, going into schism, Coptic Church, other churches of the East. We have the rise of Islam. So people normally wouldn't have, that much of an interest to study classics, humanities, as they did in previous eras. Be that as it may, the thing is that from the, let's say, mid-8th century, the interest in the classics starts rising again. Now, because problems stopped? Not really. So why would I'm tempted to think, now this is a wild guess, but it's not that wild, it's not unfounded. After the Umayyad dynasty, we have the Abbasid dynasty, 750, mid of the 8th century. And that dynasty goes a long way. It's the Abbasid dynasty is linked to what we call the golden era of medieval Islam, the classic era. And the capital is transferred to Baghdad. Baghdad becomes a center of learning. The Arabs, absorb everything they can, as much as they can. Arabs, I would say, basically Muslims, not because now they're not only Arabs, there are Persians, there's lots of other peoples as well. They absorb everything they can from the wisdom of the Hellenes of the past, because now they have the need to create the intellectual infrastructure to sustain their own empire. You cannot sustain an empire, remaining a nomad, a camel driver. You cannot. If you have managed to establish one, if you wanted to be sustained and perpetuated, you have to find, the means to make this happen. And these means are, first and foremost, there are ideas, the ideological apparatuses. The Greeks had the know-how, so they had to take it from there, okay? Because the Byzantines had it already, the Romans before them. So that's why the Muslims start, absorbing and devouring everything, copying, translating, the Greeks. So I suppose that because there was a liaison between Byzantium, Constantinople, and Baghdad, actually we know that Photius took part in one embassy to Baghdad. He was one of the very important people in that embassy, if not the most important. So this is a connection. And so the Byzantines knew that, okay, these newcomers upon the scene of history, global international relations, these newcomers, what are they doing? They're boasting to be wise, they're boasting to know science, they're boasting to be this, based on our own stuff. And what are we doing? So I think this created a sense of competition, in the Byzantines, as if, look, if we don't do something now, somebody else is going to claim our own heritage. So in this way only, they rediscover. So they start, devoting themselves to the Hellenic heritage, because someone else was challenging them in that respect. So that's more or less, let's say, the big picture. Okay. We could go on and say things about the big picture. Perhaps we can talk about it during the discussion. Now, Photius is, as I said, a very learned person, erudite person. We know this because, if anything, we have the testimony, the witness of his work regarding his library, his own library. And that library had 200 something, I think 300 books. So, and books on a variety of topics. Rhetoric, law, history, philosophy, medicine, sciences. So, to have, of course, such a library, personal library, you can only to afford it. You had to be a rich person, a noble person. We know that he was such a person, but having it, he also has read it. It's not just those libraries rich people have, and they boast about the libraries that haven't never opened a book. No, because in his work, the Biblioteca, Photius gives us sometimes very concise, sometimes more elaborate descriptions of the books he has, in his library. Well, the title of the book, the author of the book, the topics discussed in the book, and of course the contents. And sometimes he expresses his views, or this is a good book. This is, let's say, book which is not that important, or something else is very, very important. He criticizes the content as well, so we know that he has read these books, and we know of some books that in the library of thanks to the library of Photius, which we don't know of any other. There's no other witnessing about them, historical witnessing. An interesting thing pertaining to philosophy is that Photius, in one of his descriptions, talks about the Neoplatonic philosophy, and although we think of Neoplatonic philosophy as having two schools, basically, the Athens school and the Alexandria school, we read that he describes let's say, he's mapping the ancient Neoplatonism movement as comprising of 5 schools. So apart from Athens and Alexandria, there's the Neoplatonic school of Rome since the time of Plotinus. Athens, of course, which flourished a lot with Proclus and Damascus. Then we have Alexandria, but we also have 2 minor schools. One is the Syrian school, Antioch, and the other one is Ephesus. So, and he describes the features of each school and the subtle differences between them, especially the schools of Antioch and Ephesus. So he knows his Neoplatonism very, very well. And I would dare say he knows of the differentiation, the diversity of Neoplatonism more than we know. Probably because he had access to much more diverse materials than the ones we have.
That's interesting, because he's also, sorry to interrupt you,
No.
he's also probably aware of the movements within those centres.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
What's happening theologically in order to...
Yeah, absolutely. And he talks about these things, although at a time when, none of these schools is existing anymore. So they have died out, we are in the 9th century. So the only school that went on living after the early 7th century, but now in a Christian guise, was the Neoplatonic school of Alexandria. Perhaps for, let's say, one more century. So that is quite interesting, and it's interesting in many respects because it gives us a sort of smaller context that allows us to see his relationship with Plato and Aristotle. Now, if we want to be, precise, Photius was not what we would call a philosopher. He was not philosophically minded person. He knew philosophy, but in terms of character traits, that's what I mean. I wouldn't put him, and most scholars don't put him into the philosopher box. it's more into the statesman box. I mean, if he wasn't a patriarch, he would be a politician. You know, he besides he did start, you know, as a protospatarios, which is a captain of the guard of the imperial house, and a protasikritis, which is the chief secretary of the imperial house. So he was a high sort of a state official, and he would have, you know, continued his career along those lines. So he was more a practical than a theoretical person. But that doesn't mean that he didn't know about theory and he didn't cherish it. But praxis, okay, everyday life, problems posed in politics and society, that was his field. And to give you just one idea about this is, Photius is one of those who, not one of those, he was the person who basically was the first one to conceptualize, theorize the state, better the kingship, priesthood relationship in Byzantium, what we call state-church relations. So there's this famous text called the Isagogi, which, you know, he has the metaphor of the body and the soul. Okay, and each of these, let's say, faculties serve the body and the soul respectively. And this is the famous theory of synalilia. Okay, and that's how we know it from in law, the history of legal ideas, synalilia. So syn means together, okay, the church and the state, or according to the jargon of Photius, the autokrator, the emperor, and the patriarch, you know, they together, okay, work so that they benefit one another. And when this happens, those being benefited are the respective fields of reference, which is the spiritual needs, whatever that can, you know, be conceptualized as broadly as possible, and the material needs. So the emperor stands for the material needs, the patriarch stands for the spiritual needs. So if they work together, they benefit one another, and those two domains benefit as well. It's very much a metaphor based on alleloperichoresis, coherence, alleloperichoresis. Or perichoresis, eh? Perichoresis. And synalilia.
That's not the right.
Huh?
That's not the right.
So he knew his legal stuff, he knew his politics, and he was a realpolitik person. Some have regarded him as the most powerful person that the ecclesiastical domain had during the Byzantine Middle Ages. The most, and definitely he's the most powerful person. Okay, he must be credited, you know, with the conversion of the Slavs. This was one of his big visions, you know, to bring into the Christian family the enemies of the north, from the north, so there are no enemies anymore. Expanding the empire without expanding it. Okay, because those peoples, the Russians, the Bulgarians, the Serbians and so forth, all these, you know, Slav peoples, they became, you know, spiritually linked to Byzantium. And of course, they benefited a lot from being Christianized, converted, because that's when they start basically, you know, their, let's say, being culturally and civilizationally, that's when they start. Okay, that's when, you know, they start having their language written with Kyrillos and Methodios. You know, Kyrillos and Methodios from Thessaloniki. Photius, you know, called it, because they were scholars themselves, and he, you know, commissioned them to do this, and to do this by, you know, creating a language and creating the fundamentals for a culture. So if you take Christianity out of the Slavs, Orthodox Christianity out of the Slavs, it's like taking out of them, you know, their very sort of historical imprint. Because that's really when they start having a civilizational imprint, presence, voice, and so forth. But let's come to some philosophy. So, I'm going to read you something from Vasilis Statakis. Vasilis Statakis, he was a professor of philosophy, if I recall correctly well, at the University of Thessaloniki, and he wrote the first book on Byzantine philosophy. No one, you know, at the end of the 1940s dared write the phrase Byzantine philosophy. It was impossible for such a thing to exist 80 years ago. 80 years, It was impossible, because Byzantium, okay, was Middle Ages, Dark Ages, was religion, superstition, everything black, everything, you know, arachno, mavro, everything that you can, the worst things you can imagine. So philosophy has no, you know, part of that. It's not part of that. And Vasilis Statakis writes his book, Byzantine Philosophia. When I read this book when I was still in high school, I still remember the book. It was one of those books that you read and they are a watershed, you know, of inspiration, of, you know, suddenly you feel that that before you were not thinking, and suddenly you are thinking. Such a, you know, experience of learning and illumination, actually. Now, he has a variety of thinkers, a series of thinkers. One of them is Photius. And he writes regarding Photius, towards the end of his section on Photius, the following. Nominalism and real, I'm reading, of course, translation in English. Nominalism and realism were widely discussed topics during this period, the period of Photius. Photius takes care to illustrate the shortcomings involved in each of these views, as well as the impossibility of their being correct. In turn, he proposes his own, remember we said independent, formidable thinker, his own solution, which he believes unassailable. Genus and species, he claims, are corporeal, but they are not bodies. They define the substance of subjects, but are not themselves so defined. They are involved in the development of the substance of subjects, but they do not constitute it. They are the names and ideas that properly designate the hypostasis of subjects, but they do not confer upon beings which lack nothing, that which they do not need, namely existence. Photius also rejects Platonic paradigms, the pre-existence of archetypes, supposes an artisan, a fallible demiurge. Moreover, there is no adequate reason that these ideas, the paradigms, the pre-existing paradigms, forms of the immutable and immovable in the divine intelligence, serve as predicates for beings that are in a perpetual state of becoming. By eliminating these two realisms, that of Plato and that of the realists, Photius in one respect succeeds in keeping intact both God's omnipotence and the unbridgeable distance between creator and creation. Yet, from another respect, he achieves a compromise between nominalism and realism, a feat which reminds one of Stoicism. Genus and species exist. They are corporeal, but they themselves are not bodies. Now, this is very, very interesting because it touches upon, first of all, one of the most hot, like really, big controversies during the Middle Ages, the controversy about the Universalia, which is the most general ideas, names, categories. Are they real or are they just names? Nominalism, names, or are they realism? So realism and nominalism are the two positions, let's say the two extreme positions, because there were lots of other in-between positions, regarding the ontological status of the universalia, the universal notions. Now, we know that this becomes very big in the history of ideas in the Western Middle Ages, late Middle Ages with scholasticism. But here we see that it was also a problem already in the East discussed quite before the, let's say, 12th, 13th, 14th century, late Middle Ages. This is already 9th century. And we know that this was a problem discussed already before Photius, already by the Neoplatonics themselves, for instance, Proclus. The thing is that the first time that we, in the Western context, the first time we hear of ideas, the categories we use being only names, first time we hear about this, in a way, a kind of nominalism, not with such a, let's say, loaded, let's say, character, okay, attached to it, is with the so-called sophists, sophistes, in the 5th and the 4th century, because the sophistes are the first who say that, you know, there are certain things that are just names, onomata, nothing else. Because sophistes really stress the juxtaposition between something that exists the way it exists due to law, convention, habit, and nature. It's nature. So they did really, you know, they were critical of things, and for instance, customs or philosophical premises or laws, and they use this juxtaposition to advance their criticism. Is this according to nature, or is it according to convention, law, habit? Is it just an agreement? Arbitrary? Or does it have some sort of, you know, stable, solid foundation? Some of the sophists use this juxtaposition in order to speak in favor of the convention. Others used it so that they could speak in favor of thesis. It's not always against thesis or always for convention. But the sophists were the first who, during a period of, let's say, a transition period, a period of crisis, Peloponnesian War, the end of classical Greece, they really challenge and they really, you know, subvert what we know as Hellenic thinking. But it's up to that point, you know. It never became a kind of metaphysics in itself, as it became, you know, phenomenalist or realist in the late Middle Ages in the West. So we hear of the onomata thesis for the first time with the sophists. And then we have it again and again in Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah,
we do have it. Yeah. And then more prominently it becomes an issue with Stoicism, and it crystallizes with the Neoplatonics, especially with Photius. Anyhow, we see it again here in Photius. And it's interesting to see it closer so that we see in what respect he is a critical student of Hellenic philosophy. He says that the genus and the species, genus, to genus. Genus is the most, here, you should take as the most general. Το genus και το είδος. Genus is the genus, which is the most general, you know, idea you can use. Let's say, being. Being. And eidos is a specific. It can be specific in the sense like human being, can be horse, can be a pine, can be a table, can be food, can be anything. Of course, it can be even more specific than those things, because you can say, you know, human, but you can say also Vasilis. And the eidos becomes eidos ειδικότατον, which is the most specific species. Now, he says that these two, the genus and the eidos, are corporeal, but they are not bodies. So they're not like this. They're not like the table, not like us. Okay, they're not tangible. That's what he means. But they are corporeal. The genos and the eidos. So the very fact, of using being or human being, the usage of these terms can only be done in relation to something which is a body. This is the meaning of what we just read. They are corporeal, but not bodies. In Greek, είναι εν σώματα, αλλά όχι σώματα. Οι έννοιες αυτές, είναι ενσώματες. You cannot use them disassociated from our body, but they are not a body themselves.
He's very Aristotelian, right?
Yeah, he follows him, I would say, very closely. Okay. And I would regard this as an explanation of what Aristotle meant when he said that, the universalia, the καθόλου, the most general notions, are not before things or after as they, but they are in things.
Yeah.
You cannot.
Yeah,
you cannot conceive or perceive something and understand something, but with them, through them. So it's through these that a body, something tangible, can be conceptualized, can be understood, can be perceived, can be whatever, anything related to. So in a way he's saying that the notions, the καθόλου, the notions in general, the metaphysical notions, the ontological notions, are relational. Είναι σχεσιακές οι έννοιες. They denote relations.
He says that.
No, he doesn't say that.
Okay.
But that's the interpretation. So you understand what it is to be not a body, but corporeal, what is in relation to a body.
Yes.
So always we relate to a body through a concept. Okay. So it has something of the body, it's related to the body, but it's not the body itself.
In what context is he saying all this? Why does he talk about genus and species?
Because he was very much interested in dialectics and logic.
Okay.
Yeah, amongst all the philosophical sectors, he was interested in dialectics and logic, not so much in metaphysics or ethics or other things.
Okay.
They define the substance of subjects, but are not themselves so defined. So in a way, notions, these notions function as principles of understanding. They inform our understanding of this or that, but they are not informed. So in a way they are principles. Είναι αρχές κατανόησης και ως τέτοιες οι έννοιες οριοθετούν, we would say circumscribe, as something in order for that to be appropriated, to be, conceived. They are involved in the development of the substance of subjects. The development of the substance of... What is this development of the substance of subjects? I think this can only make sense if you are an empiricist. And it seems that he ascribed to, you know, empiricism. He was very much interested in the sciences. So you have a substance of a subject developing in the sense that you observe it and you see it changing, you know, a human being. Γεννιέται, μικρός, μεγαλώνει, παιδί, έφηβος, όριμος. The development of the substance of a subject. So you cannot really, it's not only that the subject, man, is understood via these principles, delimiting concepts, but also the development of the substance, the dynamics of it. So notions are not only relational, but they are also what? Dynamic. They are relational to the extent that they have a point of reference, this or that substance, and they are dynamic because they allow for the appropriation of the substance in its becoming, in its kinesis. They're not static. So they allow for.
Do you think he's trying to justify the faith, trying to understand how one grows into the faith through all this, or it's just something generally that he was curious about?
Yeah, I think he has a general curiosity, first of all, as a scholar. But of course, nothing happens, you know, in a vacuum. This is broadly, more widely informed by his faith.
Yeah.
And it has certain implications afterwards for his faith, for Christian faith in general.
Yeah.
So it's like a kind of software.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Wait till the end.
No, ask now.
Because I could be totally wrong, I probably am, but just what you're saying just makes me think about Genesis. You know, like there's the first creation and then there's two accounts.
Yeah.
Is it like these two, the Genesis and the, is there something?
No, you're saying like Adam. Adam is like a genus.
Well,
Genus,
when
yeah?
he created man, male and female, he created them. That was the first one.
Yeah, the genus, the genus. And then